February 17, 1943. A dirt road south of a Tunisian town called Spitler. The light is going grey with dust and engine smoke. A young American officer stands at the edge of the road and watches something he will spend the rest of his life trying to forget. It is not a battle, it is the end of one. Down the road, in no order anyone can name, comes the wreckage of an army that was supposed to be the future of the free world. There are trucks with no units attached to them. There are men walking who have thrown away their rifles. There are tank crews riding on the backs of other men's vehicles, because their own tanks are burning somewhere behind them in the hills. There are officers who cannot tell him what regiment they belong to anymore, because the regiment, as a thing that exists on a map, has stopped existing. He has been told these are the soldiers of the most industrially powerful nation on earth. He has been told they will win this war, and he is watching them stream past him in a single direction, which is the direction away from the enemy. By every standard the United States Army had set for itself, what was happening on that road should not have been possible. These were not cowards. Many of them would prove that within a month, in ways that would astonish the very Germans now driving them backward. They had tanks, they had artillery, they had air power somewhere above the clouds. They had a homeland that was outproducing the entire Axis combined, and they were losing, badly, to a German force that was smaller, hungrier, and running low on fuel. They were losing not because they lacked courage, and not because they lacked equipment. They were losing for a reason that is harder to look at, and far more interesting than either of those. The American soldiers on that road in February of 1943 were not being beaten by the Germans. They were being beaten by the men who were supposed to be leading them. And the most remarkable fact of this entire story, the fact that this whole investigation turns on, is this. 27 days after the Allies clawed back the ground they lost in those hills, that same beaten army, those same men in those same uniforms, stood in a valley 100 miles to the south and did something no American force had ever done in the Second World War. They broke a German panzer division to pieces in a single morning. Same soldiers, same equipment, same enemy, in some cases the exact same German division, less than a month apart. One of those battles is remembered as the worst humiliation in the modern history of the United States Army. The other is remembered as the moment the Americans learned to fight. The question is what happened in between, not on the battlefield, behind it, in the command tents and the headquarters bunkers, and the minds of a handful of men whose names most people have never heard. Because the difference between the disaster and the victory was not bravery, and it was not technology. It was something the army had been getting catastrophically wrong, and then, in 27 days, got violently, decisively right. To understand how an army can fail that completely and recover that fast, we have to go back several weeks before the road outside Spitler. We have to go to a hole in the ground, blasted 70 miles behind the front line, and to the man who ordered it dug. Because the story of how the Americans won at El Guettar is really the story of how they lost at Kasserine first. And you cannot understand the second without standing inside the first. Let us begin with the ground itself. In the winter of 1943, the war in North Africa had funneled into Tunisia. To the east, the British 8th Army under Bernard Montgomery was pushing Erwin Rommel's famous Africa Corps westward along the coast, the climax of the long campaign that had started at El Alamein. To the west and the north, a fresh Allied force that had landed in Morocco and Algeria the previous November was pressing in. The Germans and Italians were being squeezed into a pocket between two fires. On paper, the Axis position looked hopeless. In reality, that pocket was about to become one of the most dangerous places on earth for a green American soldier to be standing. The American forces in Tunisia were organized under something called the Second Corps, and the Second Corps was commanded by a major general named Lloyd Fredendall. You have almost certainly never heard his name, and there is a reason for that, which we will come to. But in February of 1943, Lloyd Fredendall was one of the most powerful American officers in the entire theater of war. He had been a favorite of General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff back in Washington, who had once described him as one of the best he had. He had risen fast, he looked the part, and he was, it turned out, almost perfectly unsuited to the job he had been given. Fredendall had a number of habits that, taken together, paint a portrait of a commander who had lost contact with the war he was supposed to be running. The first was physical distance. Rather than position his headquarters where he could see and influence the battle, Fredendall ordered his engineers to construct an enormous underground command complex about 70 miles behind the front line, tucked into a ravine far to the rear. This was no simple dugout. He pulled an entire company of combat engineers off their other duties and put them to work for weeks, blasting tunnels deep into the solid rock of a hillside to make a bomb-proof command post, ringed with anti-aircraft guns. While his frontline troops were short of mines, short of barbed wire, and short of the basic tools to dig in and defend themselves, the engineers who should have been helping them were instead deep in the rear, drilling a bomb-proof shelter for the corps commander. The men heard about it, the way soldiers always hear about these things. They started calling the place Lloyd's very last resort. They called it Shangri-La, a million miles from nowhere. Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, would later write that it was the only time in the entire war he saw a senior headquarters so worried about its own safety that it dug itself underground. Omar Bradley, who would soon play a central role in this story, called it an embarrassment to every American soldier. And here is the part that mattered most. From inside that bunker, 70 miles from the fighting, Fredendall ran his battle off a map. He almost never went forward to see the ground with his own eyes. He developed strong opinions about exactly where each unit should sit, and he imposed those opinions on commanders who were actually standing on the terrain and could see what he could not. A general who fights from a map he is reading in a tunnel is fighting a war that exists only in his imagination. The real war was happening far to the east, in hills he had never walked. The second habit was stranger, and in its own way more revealing. Fredendall did not trust the security of his communications, which was reasonable, but his solution was not better encryption. His solution was to invent his own private slang and issue orders in it. He called infantry the walking boys. He called artillery the pop guns. He referred to units not by their designations, but by riddles, the outfit that is the reverse of Baker's outfit, the place that begins with C. One of his actual orders, preserved in the record, instructed a subordinate to move the command, that is, the walking boys, the pop guns, Baker's outfit, and the outfit which is the reverse of Baker's outfit. Imagine receiving that in the middle of a collapsing front and trying to decide where to send dying men. His own officers often could not understand what he was ordering them to do. He had built a private language that confused his friends far more than it ever confused his enemies. The third and most damaging habit was how he positioned his forces. Lacking good intelligence about where the German blow would fall, Fredendall scattered his units to cover everything, which is the surest way to be strong nowhere. He took the 1st Armored Division, an outfit that drew all its power from being concentrated and used as a fist, and he broke it into fragments, spread across roughly 30 miles of front. He placed infantry on isolated hilltops, individual peaks too far apart to support one another, little islands of men surrounded by ground the enemy controlled. The commander of the 1st Armored Division, a thoughtful officer named Orlando Ward, objected to this scattering. He was overruled. The man in the bunker had decided. So that was the American position in the second week of February. Green troops who had mostly never seen combat. An armored division chopped into pieces. Infantry stranded on separate hills. A commander 70 miles to the rear, issuing riddles, fighting a map. Now bring on the enemy. And it is worth dwelling for a moment on just how green these Americans truly were, because it is the necessary backdrop to everything that follows. The United States had been at war for barely over a year. The army that landed in North Africa had been built at extraordinary speed out of a peacetime force that, only a few years earlier, had ranked among the smaller armies in the world, behind nations most people could not find on a map. Many of the men facing the panzers had never heard a shot fired in anger. Their officers, in many cases, had been civilians not long before, promoted rapidly to fill an army that was expanding faster than it could train. They had equipment that ranged from excellent to badly outclass. Their light tanks carried a 37mm gun that simply bounced off the front of a German panzer. Their doctrine for using tanks and infantry and artillery together existed mostly on paper and had never been tested against a first-rate enemy. They were, in short, amateurs about to be schooled by professionals who had been perfecting their craft since the conquest of Poland. The wonder is not that they lost at Kasserine. The wonder is how fast they stopped losing. Before dawn on February 14, 1943, the Germans struck. The operation had a name, Spring Wind, and it came through the mountain passes with about 140 tanks drawn from two veteran panzer divisions, the 10th and the 21st, supported by dug-in anti-tank guns, including the dreaded 88mm gun. They hit the American positions around a place called Sidi Bou Zid, and the isolated island defense that Fredendall had ordered did exactly what its critics feared it would do. The islands were surrounded one at a time, and they could not help each other. The American infantry on those separate hills, men of the 34th Infantry Division, watched the German armor flow around and behind them. One commander on the ground, Colonel Thomas Drake, asked for permission to pull his men back before they were cut off. Fredendall, reading his map in the tunnel, refused. He ordered them to hold and wait for reinforcements that were not coming in any strength that could matter. By the end of the first day, the American armor in that sector had been driven back roughly 15 miles and had lost dozens of tanks. The infantry on the hills were left behind, marooned, to be killed or captured at the enemy's leisure. Picture what that order actually meant for the men living it. On the peaks of those isolated hills, with names like Jebel Lesouda and Jebel Kasserine, sat several hundred American infantrymen, along with the armor and artillery parceled out among them. From their high ground, they could watch the German tanks rolling past them on the flat below, columns of armor moving freely through the gaps that the islands were supposed to seal. The men could see that they were being surrounded. They could see that the relief column sent to rescue them was itself being destroyed in the open, and they had been told to stay put. When the order to break out finally came, it came too late, and over radios the enemy was listening to. Men slipped off the hills in small parties under cover of darkness, trying to walk west through country now full of German patrols. Some made it. Hundreds did not. Colonel Drake, holding the eastern cluster of positions around Jebel Kasserine, was among those captured when his command was finally overrun. An entire regimental combat team had been fed onto those hilltops and largely swallowed, not because the men would not fight, but because they had been positioned by someone who would not look at the ground. Then came the counterattack, and the counterattack is where the disaster turned into a lesson written in fire. On February 15th, an American armored force was ordered to drive forward and restore the situation. They went in believing, on the basis of bad intelligence, that they faced only about 40 German tanks. In truth, they were driving into the combined strength of two panzer divisions and a screen of concealed anti-tank guns. The American tanks rolled across open, flat ground, in clear view, straight toward guns they could not see. German aircraft hit them first. Then the 88s opened up from positions the Americans had not even located. It was not a battle, it was a shooting gallery. The American force was torn apart, losing dozens more medium tanks in a matter of hours. Among the men captured in this phase was a lieutenant colonel named John Waters, who happened to be the son-in-law of a general named George Patton. Remember that name. He will be back, and soon. Over the next several days, the collapse spread and accelerated. The towns of Spatla and Feriana were abandoned. An airfield complex at Thalepta was given up, and with it tons of precious fuel that fell straight into German hands. The Americans were falling back toward their main supply base, and then the Germans pushed for the gap in the mountains that would give this whole catastrophe its name, the Kasserine Pass. The pass was a gap about 2 miles wide, and it was held by a scratch collection of units thrown together under a colonel named Alexander Stark, engineers and infantry and artillery, and a French battalion, none of whom had trained together as a team. On the German side, there was a now famous disagreement, and it is worth understanding, because it reveals a weakness in the Axis position that the Americans would soon exploit. Rommel, who could smell a chance to do real damage, wanted to concentrate everything into one sharp thrust, driving deep toward the great Allied supply base at Tebessa and beyond. a blow that might have unhinged the entire Allied position in Tunisia. But Rommel did not have a free hand. Von Arnim, who commanded some of the best armor and was reluctant to release it, favored a shallower effort, and the Italian high command that controlled the theater approved a cautious, divided plan rather than Rommel's bold one. The attack was split between two passes instead of concentrated on one, and the deep exploitation Rommel wanted was approved too late and too weakly. The compromise blunted the blow, which would matter very soon. There was a deeper Axis weakness underneath that quarrel, and it shaped everything. The German and Italian forces in Tunisia were being strangled for supply. Allied aircraft and submarines were sinking the ships that tried to cross the Mediterranean with fuel and ammunition. Every mile the panzers advanced burned gasoline that could not easily be replaced. An army that cannot count on its fuel cannot sustain a deep drive, no matter how brilliant its tactics. The German offensive at Kasserine was, in a sense, a gamble against the clock, a raid that had to win fast or not at all. On February 20, the Germans broke through the pass anyway. The defenders, brave but disorganized and poorly led from above, could not hold. The road into the American rear lay open. But the clock was already running against the men who had opened it. This was the low point. This was the moment captured by that young officer watching the broken column stream past him on the road. By the count that historians most often use, the Americans suffered around 6,000 casualties in these battles, roughly 300 killed, around 3,000 wounded, and something close to 3,000 captured or missing, which is the number that should make you sit up, because men are taken prisoner in those quantities only when units stop functioning as units. The material losses were staggering for an army still finding its feet. About 183 tanks destroyed, over 100 half-tracks, more than 200 artillery pieces, hundreds of trucks, and the German losses, by their own reporting, were a fraction of that. Something on the order of 200 killed, 500 wounded, 250 missing, and only about 20 tanks. That lopsided exchange is the entire meaning of the word humiliation in this context. This was not a hard-fought battle where both sides bled equally. This was a beating. Omar Bradley, writing near the end of his long life, decades after the war, still could not soften it. He said that even all those years later, it pained him to reflect on that disaster, and that it was probably the worst performance of United States Army troops in their whole proud history. That is not an enemy's judgment. That is the verdict of one of America's own greatest commanders on his own army. So we have established the depth of the hole. Now comes the question that makes this story worth telling. How does an army climb out of a hole that deep in less than a month? And the answer begins not with a weapon and not with a new tank, but with a decision about a man. While the front was collapsing, Eisenhower had already begun to sense that the problem was not entirely the soldiers. On February 20, with the situation at its worst, he sent forward one of his most aggressive officers, a major general named Ernest Harmon, to assess what was happening and to steady the line. Harmon drove through the chaos to Fredendall's underground headquarters in the small hours of the morning. What he found there told him most of what he needed to know. Fredendall, by Harmon's account, was a man coming apart. He more or less handed Harmon a note authorizing him to take charge of the fighting, and then he went to bed while the battle raged 70 miles away. Harmon went forward and did what he could, helped in no small part by the fact that the Germans, overextended and low on fuel, were already reaching the end of their own offensive. The Axis attack was running out of momentum. It was finally halted, and this detail matters enormously for everything that follows, primarily by massed Allied artillery at two towns called Thala and Speba, just past the pass. American gunners, joined by British guns and reinforced by an artillery force that had made an epic forced march of hundreds of miles to get into position, simply put up a wall of steel the Germans could not walk through. On February 22, Rommel, looking at his losses and his dwindling fuel and the stiffening resistance, called the whole offensive off. By February 24, the Allies had reoccupied the Kasserine Pass. Hold on to that date, February 24. That is where our clock starts ticking. When Harmon came back from the front, Eisenhower asked him what he thought. Harmon's verdict on Fredendall was blunt and unprintable in polite company. The gist of it was that the man was no good and had to go. Around the same time, Eisenhower had quietly sent another officer to take the temperature of the Corps. That officer was Omar Bradley, and when Eisenhower asked him directly what he thought of the command situation, Bradley did not soften it either. He said it was pretty bad, that he had spoken to every one of the division commanders, and that to a man they had lost confidence in Fredendall. When the generals who report to a commander have all stopped believing in him, that commander is finished, whatever his record on paper says. Eisenhower made his decision. Fredendall would be relieved, but how he did it tells you something important about how armies actually work, as opposed to how we imagine they work. Eisenhower did not disgrace him. He first offered the Corps to Harmon, who turned it down on a point of honor, refusing to profit from the bad report he himself had delivered. So Eisenhower turned to the man he had been holding in reserve for exactly this kind of moment, and Fredendall was sent home not in shame, but with quiet honors, soon promoted to lieutenant general and given command of an army back in the United States, a training command far from any enemy. It was politically convenient to let him fade out as a hero rather than admit how badly the senior leadership, all the way up, had erred in choosing him. The army protected itself. The man who replaced him would have no patience for any of that. On March 6, 1943, George Patton took command of the Second Corps, and the clock that started at February 24 was now at day 10. He did not come alone, and the man who came with him matters almost as much as Patton himself. Omar Bradley, who had toured the Corps and delivered that damning verdict to Eisenhower, was assigned as Patton's deputy. In part, this was Eisenhower's way of keeping a steady, level-headed pair of eyes beside the famously volatile Patton, a check on his temper and his impulses. Patton understood exactly what Bradley was and chose, wisely, to keep him close and to use him rather than resent him. The two men could hardly have been more different. Patton was theatre and fire and profanity. Bradley was quiet, plain-spoken, almost professorial, the kind of commander soldiers trusted precisely because he did not perform. Together they made a more complete leadership than either could have provided alone, and the partnership formed in Tunisia would run all the way through Sicily and into the campaign in Europe. The recovery of the American army was not one man's work. From the very first day, it was at least two. It is worth pausing on who Patton actually was at this moment, because the legend has almost swallowed the man. Patton was 57 years old. He was a cavalryman of the old school, a former Olympic athlete, a pioneer of American tank warfare in the First World War. He believed, with an intensity that bordered on the theatrical, in discipline, aggression, pride, and the will to attack. He had just commanded the landings at Casablanca a few months earlier. He was profane, vain, deeply emotional, and he understood something about armies that the man in the bunker had never grasped. He understood that an army is not a machine. It is a living thing made of frightened human beings, and frightened human beings can be led, but only by someone willing to stand where they can see him. Patton arrived at the Second Corps headquarters and was, by his own diary, initially almost gracious about his predecessor. That did not last. Within a week, he was writing that he could not see what Fredendall had done to justify his existence, and that he had never seen so little order or discipline in his life. And then he went to work. What followed is the heart of the transformation, and it is also the part most often misunderstood. So it is worth being precise about what Patton actually did and what he did not do. He did not hand the men new weapons. He did not change the tanks. He did not invent a new tactic. What he changed, starting on his very first morning, was the culture, and he started with things so small that they have struck some people, ever since, as almost absurd. On his first full day in command, Patton ordered the headquarters mess closed at 7:30 in the morning. If you were late for breakfast, you did not eat. He decreed that every soldier in the Corps, at all times, would wear a steel helmet, properly strapped, even far behind the lines, even walking to the latrine. Officers would wear neckties. Everyone would wear the canvas leggings that soldiers hated. Everyone would shave every single day, even when water was scarce. and there were fines for violations, real money, $25 a time, which was about half a month's pay for a private. He fined infantrymen, he fined truck drivers, he fined the elite rangers, he fined tank destroyer crews. Nobody was exempt, not the famous units and not the green ones. Now, on the surface, this looks ridiculous. There are men dying in the hills and the new general is worried about neckties and breakfast hours. Soldiers grumbled bitterly. But Patton understood exactly what he was doing, and Omar Bradley, watching it happen, explained it better than anyone has since. Bradley said that each time a soldier knotted his necktie, threaded his hated leggings, and buckled on that heavy steel helmet, he was being forcibly reminded that the days before Kasserine were over, and that a tough new era had begun. The discipline was not about the necktie. The discipline was about the message the necktie carried. The message was, you are a soldier again, you are part of something that has standards, somebody is in charge, and that somebody expects you to win. An army that has been routed does not need a lecture. It needs to feel, in 100 small daily ways, that the chaos is over. But Patton did far more than enforce dress codes, and this is where we have to be careful, because the dress code is the part that makes the good story, and it is not actually the part that won the next battle. Patton also did the unglamorous professional work that Fredendall had failed to do. He pulled the scattered armor back together so it could be used as a concentrated force instead of a handful of separate fragments. He insisted that the different arms, the infantry and the tanks and above all the artillery, learn to fight as a coordinated team rather than as strangers who happened to be on the same battlefield. He went forward constantly, showing his face where the troops could see it, the exact opposite of a commander who ran his war by telephone from the rear. He radiated a ferocious confidence that the corps absorbed like dry ground absorbing rain. He could also be brutal in ways that are hard to read comfortably today. He genuinely believed that a unit which took no casualties was a unit that was not trying hard enough. There is a chilling exchange on record where Orlando Ward, the armored division commander, mentioned that he had been fortunate to lose no officers in a particular action, and Patton erupted at him, telling him that this was not good fortune at all, that it was bad for the morale of the enlisted men to see their officers surviving safely, and that he wanted to see more officers getting killed. That is not a sentiment that fits comfortably into an inspirational story, but it is true, and leaving it out would be a lie of omission. Patton's philosophy had a hard, cold edge to it. He was preparing men to die, and he had decided that sentimentality would kill more of them in the end than ruthlessness would. There was one more problem Patton inherited that no amount of discipline could fix on its own, and it nearly cost him his composure. The Americans on the ground felt, with some justice, that they were being bombed and strafed by German aircraft while their own air force was nowhere to be seen. The system for getting Allied planes overhead when and where the ground troops needed them was slow and clumsy, run through a command structure that kept the aircraft pooled far to the rear for larger missions rather than parceled out to cover the front. Soldiers who have just watched their friends die under an air attack do not care about the theory of air power. They care that the sky belongs to the enemy. In early April, after Patton had taken the corps into action, German planes bombed his own forward command post and killed several men, including a young aide named Captain Richard Jensen, an officer Patton loved like a son. Grief made him reckless. He fired off an official report under his own name, bitterly blaming the casualties on a total lack of air cover. The senior British air commander in the theatre, an air marshal named Cunningham, fired back just as sharply, questioning whether Patton understood air power at all, and even hinting that the trouble lay with the fighting spirit of Patton's troops, rather than with the airmen. It became a genuine crisis between the Allies, smoothed over only when the most senior commanders intervened, and Cunningham came in person to make peace. The episode is worth remembering for two reasons. It shows that Patton was a human being who could be knocked off balance by loss like anyone else. And it shows that the recovery of the American army was not a smooth, clean story of one man's genius. It was messy, it was full of friction, and it was argued out in real time by flawed people under enormous strain. Out of that friction, though, came a slow improvement in how air and ground learned to work together, an improvement that would keep paying off long after Tunisia. And here is the crucial thing to hold in your mind as we move toward the valley where this all comes to a head. Patton's discipline and Patton's leadership were real, and they mattered. But they did not, by themselves, win anything. They were one ingredient. The others were just as important, and they get mentioned far less often. The American soldiers were no longer green. They had been in combat now. They had been beaten, and being beaten and surviving is itself a brutal form of education. They had seen the 88s and lived. They had learned, in the words of one soldier from that period, the single most valuable lesson available to any frightened man facing a feared enemy, which was that the enemy was not 10 feet tall. The Germans could be hurt. The Germans could be stopped. They had watched it happen at Thala and Speba, where the artillery held the line. And that artillery is the third great factor, and arguably the decisive one. American artillery in this campaign was good. It had been good even in the disaster. One of the few bright spots in the whole Kasserine catastrophe had been the skill and steadiness of the American gunners. What the Americans had, that the Germans were increasingly running out of, was a deep and reliable supply of shells and the radios and the trained observers to bring that fire down fast and accurately on a single point. Concentrate that artillery, control it well, and put it behind men fighting from good ground, and you have a weapon that can stop a tank attack cold. Patton's reorganization helped concentrate it. The terrain of the next battle would do the rest. So now we have the pieces in place, a relieved commander and a new one, a discipline shock that restored the army's sense of itself. Troops who had been blooded and had lost their terror of the enemy, a powerful, well-supplied artillery arm waiting to be used properly, and a German enemy that still, fatally, believed the Americans were the same beaten rabble they had chased through the passes a few weeks before. That German contempt was about to become very expensive. In the middle of March, the larger Allied plan called for the Second Corps to go on the offensive. But it was a limited offensive with a specific purpose. The main event was happening far to the east, where Montgomery's 8th Army was preparing to smash into the heavily fortified German position called the Mareth Line. Patton's job was to push eastward from the western mountains, to threaten the German rear, to draw off German reserves, and to make the enemy nervous, all of which would help Montgomery. Patton was specifically ordered not to go charging all the way to the coast. It was a supporting role, and Patton, who craved glory, chafed against the limits of it, but he obeyed them. The offensive opened around March 17. The 1st Infantry Division, the famous Big Red one, commanded by an unconventional and fiercely beloved general named Terry Allen, took the town of Gafsa. The advance went in through driving rain that turned the desert tracks to mud and slowed the vehicles to a crawl, but the resistance the Americans braced for never came. The Italian division holding Gafsa had already pulled back into the hills, so the town fell without a real fight and became a forward base for the push to come. The next night, a battalion of Rangers under Colonel William Darby pushed forward and seized the oasis town of El Guettar, just beyond it. The Italians fell back into the rugged hills and mountains that ringed the valley to the east, strong defensive country full of ridges and ravines, and there they intended to make a stand. Over the following days, the Americans fought their way up into those hills, and this is where the difference 5 weeks had made began to show. At Kasserine, green American units had been outmaneuvered in broken terrain. Now it was the Americans doing the maneuvering. In a night action that has become part of the Ranger legend, Darby's men moved through the dark up a difficult height, scaled a cliff that the defenders had assumed no force could climb, and came down on top of an Italian position from above and behind at first light. The shock was total. The Rangers took around 200 prisoners and cleared a key piece of the high ground. It was exactly the kind of bold, improvised ground-reading operation that the Army of February had seemed incapable of. By March 22, Terry Allen's men held the high ground on both sides of the valley and looked down on the vital road that ran from Gafsa toward the coast at Gabes. They had smashed several Italian battalions to do it. This was the moment the battle stopped being about Italians and became about Germans. The collapse of the Italian defense in those hills threatened to tear open the whole southern end of the Axis line. The German command would not allow it. Under the direction of Field Marshal Kasserine, the senior German officer in the theatre, and von Arnim, who held command of the Axis army group now that Rommel was gone, the 10th Panzer Division was committed to the counterattack, the same veteran division that had helped wreck the Americans at Sidi Bouzid 5 weeks earlier. Its orders were to drive west into the El Guettar Valley and throw the Americans back. The German command still held the Americans cheap. They expected this to be a spoiling attack, a sharp shove that would send the Green Yankees reeling once again. They were about to discover that the army they were attacking was not the army they had beaten in February. It is worth saying a word here about the man waiting for them, because Terry Allen was a particular kind of leader, and the kind matters. He was not a polished, by-the-book officer. He had nearly washed out of the army more than once in his younger days. He drank, he disliked spit and polish, and he ran his division with an informality that made some of his superiors uneasy. Bradley, who would later relieve him for exactly these qualities, thought he indulged his men too much. But Allen's soldiers worshipped him, and they did so because he was one of them, and because he led from where they were. He believed in aggression, in night attacks, in trusting his subordinates to use their heads. He had built the 1st Infantry Division into a unit that fought with a swagger, a confidence that bordered on arrogance, and in the valley at El Guettar, that confidence was about to be worth more than any manual. The contrast with Fredendall could not be sharper. One commander had fought the war from a tunnel he could not see out of. The other was about to fight it from directly in the path of the German tanks. The German force assembled about 9 miles east of El Guettar. It was built around the 10th Panzer Division under a general named Friedrich von Broich, and it numbered something like 6,000 men, with roughly 50 serviceable tanks, plus assault guns, tank destroyers, and infantry in half-tracks and on motorcycles. And here we have to clear away one of the most beloved pieces of fiction in all of military history, because this battle is the one where the legend most badly distorts the truth. There is a famous scene, which many people remember from a celebrated motion picture made in 1970, in which Patton stands on high ground watching this battle unfold, having supposedly read his German opponent's book on tank warfare, and shouts in triumph that he read the enemy's book. It is a magnificent scene. It is also entirely invented. Patton never said those words. The line was written by screenwriters. More to the point, the German general most associated with that legend, Erwin Rommel, was not even in Africa for this battle. Rommel had left the continent for the last time on March 9, his health broken, never to return. The attack was launched under von Arnim's command and led into the valley by von Broich. The book that the movie shows on Patton's nightstand was a sequel that the real Rommel had planned but never actually wrote. His real published work was an earlier book on infantry tactics. I tell you this not to spoil a good scene, but because this story is powerful enough without the myths, and the men who really fought it deserve to be remembered as they were, and not as a screenwriter imagined them. At about 6 o'clock in the morning on March 23, 1943, the 10th Panzer Division came out of the eastern end of the valley and attacked. And this is day 27, 27 days after the Allies retook the Kasserine Pass. The same enemy division that had been part of breaking the Americans there came rolling toward them across open ground in the dawn light. The German attack was bold, and it was fast. Motorized infantry in half-tracks and on motorcycles charged forward alongside the tanks. The panzers maneuvered to do exactly what they had done at Sidi Bouzid, to drive deep, overrun the forward infantry, and get in among the American artillery and destroy it. At first it looked as though it might work. The German armor overran the forward positions of an American infantry battalion. The tanks pushed on toward the guns and toward the division headquarters itself. And here we meet Terry Allen at the moment that defines him. As the German tanks ground closer to his command post, someone raised the question of pulling the headquarters back to safety. Allen refused, in language that became famous in his division. He said he would like hell pull out, and that he would personally shoot the first man who tried to. The commander was staying. The message that radiated out from that decision was the precise opposite of a man in a bunker 70 miles to the rear. The man in charge was here, in the path of the tanks, and he was not leaving. Compare that, for one moment, to a general handing a stranger a note and going to bed. That contrast, more than any necktie, is the transformation this story is about. Then the American defense, the thing that had been so carefully rebuilt over 27 days, began to do its work. The first thing the German tanks hit was a minefield, sown across their path, and it cost them several tanks before they had even closed with the defenders. As the attack lost a little of its momentum on those mines, the rest of the American combined arms machine opened up. On the flanking high ground sat the American infantry with their anti-tank guns and observers. In the valley sat the tank destroyer battalions, the 601st and the 899th with their guns. And behind it all, controlled and concentrated and devastating, sat the massed divisional artillery. By some accounts, one company of the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion caught a group of about 30 German tanks in the flank and knocked out 8 of them within minutes. Whatever the exact tally in those first chaotic minutes, the American gunners, infantry, and tank destroyers worked together in a way that the Army of February could not have managed, pouring fire into the valley from multiple directions at once. The German tanks, caught in the open between the minefield and the high ground, with shells coming at them from the front and both flanks, began to burn. Over the course of roughly an hour, around 30 of the 10th Panzer Division's tanks were destroyed. By 9 in the morning, the surviving German armor was pulling back out of the valley the way it had come. The dawn attack had failed completely. The Germans were not finished for the day. In the late afternoon, around 4:45, they came again, and this time they led with infantry rather than tanks, hoping to find a softer path. They found instead the full weight of the American artillery, firing airbursts that rained shrapnel down on the advancing men. It was methodical, and it was merciless. There is a moment recorded from that afternoon that captures the strange horror of a one-sided fight. Patton, watching German infantry being torn apart by his guns, is said to have remarked that it seemed almost a crime to slaughter good infantry that way. After about 2 hours, the second attack collapsed like the first. The Germans gave up. The valley was held. The victory was real, and it was decisive, but it was not free, and a truthful account has to say so. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion, which had done so much of the killing, paid for it, losing 14 men and about 21 of its 31 vehicles in the fighting. Tank destroyers were lightly armored by design, killers that could themselves be killed easily, and that price shows the savagery of the close-range duel in the valley. But when the day ended, the tally was clear. The 10th Panzer Division had been shattered as an attacking force. It had lost something like half of its tanks in a single day, and the survivors were in no condition to try again, and the Americans were still standing on the ground they had come to hold. It is important to be honest about what this victory was and what it was not, because the temptation to inflate it is strong. Guettar was a defensive triumph. The Americans broke a German armored attack, the first time in the war they had decisively done so. That is its real and lasting significance, and it is enormous. But the offensive that followed in the days after, the attempt to push on through the hills along the road toward the coast, bogged down badly against stubborn Italian defenders stiffened by German armor. Allen's infantry and the armor sent forward to support them threw themselves against fortified heights along the road to Gabès, hills known to the soldiers only by the numbers on their maps, and found the enemy dug in, well-sighted, and unwilling to move. The fighting there over the following days was grinding and costly and produced very little ground. The Americans took painful casualties trying to break through and could not manage it cleanly. The road was finally opened only weeks later, after Montgomery's 8th Army cracked the main Axis line to the east, and the whole German position began to come apart, at which point the defenders in front of the Second Corps pulled back because they had to, not because they had been driven. Guettar was not a war-winning breakthrough. It was something more important than that. It was proof. What had it proved? It had proved that the failure of February had not been a failure of the American soldier. The men who broke the 10th Panzer Division in that valley were, to a remarkable degree, The very same men who had streamed broken down that road outside Spitler 5 weeks earlier. They had not been issued new courage. They had been given competent leadership, a restored sense of discipline and pride. The hard schooling of combat survived, and above all, the chance to fight as a coordinated team from good ground, with their magnificent artillery, used the way it was meant to be used. The variable that changed between Kasserine and Guettar was not the quality of the men. It was almost everything sitting above the men. It was command. This is the answer to the question we started with, the question of how a beaten army climbs out of a hole that deep in 27 days. It climbs out because the hole was never really dug by the soldiers in the first place. It was dug 70 miles behind them, in a tunnel, by a man fighting a map, and it was filled back in by men who understood that you lead from the front, that you concentrate your strength, that you fight as a combined team, and that an army is a living thing that has to believe in itself before it can win. Change the leadership, and the same men become a different army. That is the entire lesson of those 27 days, and armies have been relearning it and forgetting it ever since. Historians who have spent their lives on this campaign do not all weigh the ingredients the same way, and that disagreement is worth knowing about, because it keeps us honest. Some put the leadership change at the center and tell the story as the arrival of Patton, the firing of the failures, the restoration of grip. Others argue that the most important thing was simpler and slower, that any Green Army takes its first beating and learns from it, and that the men of the Second Corps would have improved no matter who commanded them, because combat itself is the harshest and most effective teacher there is. Still others point at the artillery and the logistics and say the real American advantage was industrial, that the United States could put more steel on a target faster than the enemy could, and that Guettar was where that advantage was finally used correctly. And a few caution against the whole drama of it, pointing out that Kasserine, painful as it was a local and quickly recovered setback rather than a true strategic catastrophe, and that calling it the Army's darkest hour flatters the story more than the facts allow. The honest answer is that all of these are partly right. The transformation was leadership and learning and firepower and a flawed enemy all at once, braided together so tightly that pulling out a single decisive thread does the truth a disservice. What is not in dispute is the result. The army that limped out of February was not the army that stood firm in March. We should resist the urge to make this a story about one heroic general single-handedly turning the tide, because that is not what the record shows, and it cheapens what actually happened. Patton lit the fuse. His discipline and his presence and his ferocious will gave the Corps back its spine in a matter of days. But the explosion in that valley was built by many hands. It was built by the artillerymen who had been good all along and were now allowed to mass their fire. It was built by tank destroyer crews who died at their guns. It was built by infantry who had learned the hard way that the enemy could bleed. It was built by Terry Allen refusing to leave his post, and by Omar Bradley's quiet competence as Patton's deputy, and by the simple, brutal fact that the soldiers of February had survived to become the veterans of March. And it was helped, let us be fair, by a German enemy that was overextended, low on fuel and supply, and arrogant enough to believe the Americans had not learned anything since February. The Germans learned otherwise. The contempt that had let them launch a casual armored attack into that valley did not survive the day. And there is a piece of testimony on this that is worth more than any American boast, because it comes from the other side. Erwin Rommel himself, in the papers he left behind, looked back on the Americans in Tunisia and wrote something that historians have quoted ever since. He observed that in Tunisia, the Americans had paid a stiff price for their experience, but that it had brought them rich dividends. He noted that even at that early stage, the American commanders showed themselves very advanced in the handling of their forces. That is the architect of the Kasserine disaster, the most famous German general of the war, acknowledging in his own hand that the Americans had learned, and learned fast, and that the price they paid in February had bought something real by spring. He of all people understood what he was looking at, because he had helped teach them the lesson. The Tunisia campaign ground on for another 7 weeks after Guettar. Patton handed the Second Corps over to Omar Bradley in the middle of April to go and plan the invasion of Sicily, and it was Bradley who led the corps in its final drive to the sea. The Axis pocket was squeezed from every side until it could no longer be supplied or defended. On May 13, 1943, the German and Italian forces in Tunisia surrendered. The numbers were staggering. Something on the order of 250,000 Axis soldiers went into captivity, a catastrophe for Germany, on a scale that bears comparison with Stalingrad, which had ended only a few months before. Goebbels, the German propaganda minister, privately called it Tunisgrad. The Mediterranean was open. The road to Sicily, to Italy, and eventually to the heart of Europe lay ahead. And the American army that would walk that road was an army that had been forged, in part, in 27 brutal days, between a humiliation and a vindication. If you ever stand at an American military cemetery in North Africa, you will see the rows of white marble crosses and stars stretching out under the sun, and most of the names on them will mean nothing to you. They are not the names in the textbooks. They are the names of truck drivers and riflemen and gunners and tank crewmen, ordinary young men from ordinary American towns who were thrown into the deep end of a war they did not start and at first did not know how to fight. Some of them died on that road outside Spatler in February, paying for the mistakes of men who never saw the front. And some of them lived through February to stand in the valley at El Guettar in March and break a German panzer division with their own hands, and a few of those then died in the hills beyond it, going forward. The difference between those 2 months was not written in their courage. The courage was there the whole time. The difference was written in the decisions made above them, by men deciding whether to fight from a tunnel or from the front, whether to scatter strength or to concentrate it, whether to treat an army as a machine or as a living thing that needs to believe. Lloyd Fredendall went home to a hero's welcome and a comfortable command, and faded from memory. The men he failed are remembered, when they are remembered at all, only by the people who study these things, and by whatever family still carries their photographs. That seems exactly backward, and maybe saying so, here, 80 years later, sets it a little more right. So when you think of the United States Army of the Second World War, that confident, war-winning force that came ashore in Normandy and fought its way to Germany, remember that it was not born confident. It was born in the dust of a Tunisian road in February of 1943, broken and streaming to the rear, and it grew up, very suddenly, in a valley 100 miles south, 27 days later. The soldiers did not change in those 4 weeks. What changed was that someone finally led them. That is the whole story, and it is enough. If your family carried a story from that campaign, from Tunisia, from the Big Red One, from the First Armored, from any of the men who were there, I would be honored to read it. Those names and those memories are the real record, and they deserve to be kept. If this account gave you something to think about, the kind of history that tells the truth about both the failure and the recovery, then stay a while. There are more of these stories to tell, and every one of them, in the end, is about ordinary people who were asked to do something extraordinary, and who, once someone finally showed them how, did exactly that.